Well, last time we were together, we began to look at this wonderful book of Ruth. And we traced last time this small family and their movements as they emigrated from Bethlehem in Israel to the country of Moab. And we watched in horror as blow after blow seemed to be rained down on them. And in the end, Naomi is left as the sole survivor of that original family. It's as if this was a family engulfed by tragedy. But Naomi isn't alone. She has two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And the three widows are three women absorbed by grief. They're grief-stricken, they're heart-broken. But we noted last time that this tragedy that's recorded in verses 1 to 5 is only the beginning. In fact, if you do the sums, it's less than 7% of the book of Ruth. There's another 93% yet to come. God isn't finished. And indeed, the most important chapters in Naomi's life are yet to come. They are yet to occur. And we might ask the question, well, why does God record such a thing as this in his word? Why is this here? Well, I think the answer to that question is found in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. In chapter 10, verse 11, he says this, "Now these things," he's writing about the Old Testament, "these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come." He's saying these things happened to the people in the Old Testament so that we might learn lessons from them for our lives. So that we might learn spiritual lessons. So that's what we need to do. We need to learn spiritual lessons from this book of Ruth. And by God's grace, hopefully we'll learn some this morning. Now, Naomi is not left mourning. A new chapter in Naomi's life begins with verse 6 of chapter 1. And I want us to consider verses 6 and 7 and to consider this new beginning. And we'll do so under three titles: Naomi's decision, Naomi's desire, and Naomi's determination. So let's think firstly about Naomi's decision. We must go back to the small house where they lived in Moab and go into the gloomy front room and see there the three devastated women, reeling under the catalogue of disasters that has hit them. Sometimes, no doubt, they found a quiet corner, each of them, where they could weep in private. Sometimes maybe they sat together and one of them would start crying until they were all crying. This was a terrible place, a place of great grief. Sometimes they just sat in silence as they tried to make sense of what seemed to make no sense. They were numb. The three men they loved were gone. And with them had gone any hope that the small holding that they were running and operating would remain viable. They had no life insurance policy. There was no social security. The future was bleak. Their prospects were grim. And it's while they're in this situation, this mourning, this sadness, that the older of the three women, the older widow, Naomi, she takes the initiative. She makes a decisive move. Naomi rises from her chair and she says to the two daughters-in-law, I am returning from Moab. I am going back. This was a big decision. What was it that brought her to that decision? What were the factors that enabled her to arrive at that decision? What were the motivations that drove her to that decision? We must consider, secondly, then, Naomi's desire. And I think the scripture reveals to us three strands in that, and we'll consider each of those three under this heading of Naomi's desire. The first strand is the emptiness of Moab. Now I want you to notice in verse 6 how it refers to Moab. She arose with her daughters-in-law, and that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab. And in fact, the same phrase is used in verse 2. And now it doesn't really come out in the English, but the word country implies field, patch of ground. Now, when Elimelech and Naomi set off from Israel, from Bethlehem, to come to Moab, Moab looked a better place. The grass looked greener in Moab. They came with confidence that they would build a better life in Moab. But a lot of water had passed under the bridge in 10 years. And now it was a country. Now it was a field. Now it was a patch. Now it seemed smaller. Now it seemed much more limited than when they arrived. Now the grass didn't look greener. In fact, it looked about as digestible as a cactus. The fullness that Moab once offered seemed to have collapsed in her thinking. This is a wonderful example of the proverb. Proverbs 14 verse 12. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And Naomi had learnt that by bitter experience. But I want you to notice further on in the chapter in verse 15 how she speaks to Ruth about Orpah. Notice her words. She says that Orpah has gone back to her people and to her gods. What's she saying? It wasn't that the people of Moab were necessarily unfriendly. Indeed, they may have shown great kindness and sympathy to her on the death of her husband and the death of her sons. But she herself had this increasing feeling in her heart that she didn't belong there. That this was not her home. And the gods of Moab, Chemosh, well, they were idols. Dumb, stupid, lifeless idols, as all idols are. And they did nothing for Naomi. For Naomi, she felt an increasing distance from the place. She felt an increasing disconnect from the people. And she had a dissatisfaction with the religion that was on offer. Naomi was empty. And she felt that Moab was empty. Now that's our first lesson. Let me ask you a question. Have you learnt that lesson? You know, sometimes in life we follow our noses. Sometimes we follow, as the prayer book says, the devices and desires of our own hearts. Maybe you've done that in your life and things haven't turned out as you thought. Things haven't turned out as you expected or even as you dreamed. You know, the world promises much. The world has its shining lights. The world has its tastes, its flavours, its smells, its attractions. The world promises us wealth, prosperity, love, relationships, security. And sometimes, literally, sometimes metaphorically, these things crumble to dust in front of our eyes. Our hopes, our dreams, our aspirations, they evaporate like steam from the kettle. And sometimes it takes catastrophe and calamity to bring us to ourselves and to our senses. And maybe this current coronavirus crisis will do just that to many people. Bring them to themselves and to their senses. But have you come to yourself and to your senses? Have you realized that the world will not and cannot satisfy you? Your Moab is empty. And your Moab will leave you empty too. That's the first thing, the emptiness of Moab in her thinking. The second thing was bread in the homeland. See, Naomi, maybe she'd been thinking for a while about life around her and the fact that she was dissatisfied. But there was something stirring within her, something deep within her. Something in her heart, something in her soul. It wasn't just that she had negative feelings towards Moab, but that there was something positive there. She had this increasing longing and yearning for Israel, for Judah. Now notice how it's put in verse 7, because there's a play on words here between verse 6 and verse 7. At the end of the verse, they went on the way to return to the land of Judah, not the country. And again, it doesn't really come out in the English, but the word land implies a broad expanse. It implies great horizons. It implies far-flung frontiers. Judah seemed bigger and broader and less claustrophobic than Moab. But it wasn't just the size of it. She receives news. Intelligence comes to her from the homeland. there's bread. There's bread there. The famine that was there in verse 1 is over. And the justification, the primary justification for coming to Moab in the first place, well, it was no longer there. And if Moab wasn't really satisfying her, if there was no real advantage to remain in Moab, well, why not go back? Now, this would be a big move for an older woman. We need to ask Naomi some questions. Naomi, isn't there bread in Moab? Well, yes. Haven't you got 10 years' worth of friends and neighbours in Moab? Well, yes. And what about your network of contacts in Moab that make life tick? Well, yes. And what about your 2 daughters-in-law? Haven't you thought of them? Yes. But she would say to you, look, listen, this doesn't satisfy my longing. It doesn't fill the void that's in my heart. A void that seems to be growing every day until it's like a giant chasm that nothing can fill. Tell me, have you learnt that lesson? Maybe you're a Christian, but maybe you've wandered off into the world. And maybe deep down in your heart, there's a dissatisfaction. Maybe you're becoming dissatisfied with the world. But maybe there's more than that. Maybe there's a longing, a yearning in your heart for something else. Maybe you're not even really sure what it is you're longing for. Maybe you're not really sure what it is you're yearning for. Maybe you can't put it into words. But sometimes you reflect on the early days of becoming a Christian. Don't you remember those days? You remember the joy. You remember the friendship, the fellowship we call it. And maybe there's a hunger for that in you. If only I could get a slice of that back. If only I could experience the joy and the friendship and the fellowship again. Maybe that's you. Well, for Naomi, it wasn't just an emotional thing. It wasn't just nostalgia. It wasn't she was trying to go back to the past for the sake of the past. It wasn't even that she was being patriotic. No, there was much more to it than that. It wasn't just that there was bread in Bethlehem. There was something far more important. Thirdly, in this aspect of her desire, the Lord was in Israel. Notice how it's put. See, the news that there's bread in Bethlehem comes to Naomi and is put to Naomi in a very particular way. The news comes as evidence of something altogether more important. A development that's altogether more significant. There is something eminently more satisfying than bread in Bethlehem. Notice how it's put. The Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. The Lord, Jehovah was back. Jehovah was there. And now Naomi realized what it is she's yearning for. Her soul was hungry. She now knows there's a bread in Bethlehem which was never available in Moab. Jehovah, the bread of heaven. And in his kindness and grace, he gets the message through to Naomi that he's there. And he reawakens in Naomi her desire for him. Naomi has been backslidden. Naomi has been living apart from God. She's kept God at arm's length. She's lived at a distance from God. But now her desire for God is reawakened. Now she can't get enough of him. Now she can't stop speaking about him when she's never spoken about him before in the book. Listen to her words in verse 8. Go, return each to the house of her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you. Verse 9. The Lord grant you that you may find rest in the house of a husband. Verse 13. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Verse 21. The Lord has brought me home again. Verse 21 again. The Lord has testified against me. The Lord, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. Tell me, have you learnt this lesson? Maybe this is you. Yes, you've realised there's an emptiness in the world. Yes, you've realised there's a yearning in your heart. But listen, if you're a backslidden Christian, that means something. It means that once you came to trust in Jesus Christ. Once you put your faith in him. Once you knew the joy of the forgiveness of sins. You knew that you were clean before God. Once you knew all that. Once you tasted and saw that the Lord is good. And once you've tasted God, nothing else tastes as sweet. Nothing tastes as good as that. Everything else tastes bland. Everything else looks trivial. Listen, if you've been living apart from God, only returning will meet your need. Only God can fill the void. Only God can satisfy your soul. But just as a note here, for those of you who, well, you haven't backslidden, you're not living apart from God. This is very interesting. When God visited his people, those who were backslidden were reawakened. And if God is to visit us, and his presence is to be known here, and the news of that begins to filter out, those who once worshipped with us but have backslidden will be reawakened. But you know, coming back isn't easy. It wasn't easy for Naomi. So we need to think finally of Naomi's determination. See, without the help and protection of her husband and her 2 sons, this journey for the older woman was going to be difficult. It was going to be treacherous. But it wasn't so much the journey that was the problem. It was the arriving that was the problem. That was going to be humbling. She left with high hopes and possibly with a high hand. Maybe there were many in Bethlehem who were deeply hurt and upset by her leaving. And to return is to say, I got it wrong. I got it wrong. And that's never easy. But the desire grew in her. It grew so much that it became a compulsion in her that she must return. She had to return. She will return. And if returning to the Lord meant returning to Bethlehem, then so be it. God was calling, and he could not be ignored. She couldn't sneak across the Jordan and kind of settle down anonymously in some out-of-the-way village in the middle of nowhere. No. She must go back to Bethlehem, where it all began, and where it all began to go wrong. She had nothing, in a sense, to offer God, except a broken and a contrite heart, which we now know God will never despise. And the growth in her yearning is matched by the growth in her determination, until she gets, as it were, to verse 7. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was. That's it. I'm going. Nothing's going to keep me back. Have we learnt this lesson? Maybe you're backslidden. Nobody knows about it. Nobody in the church knows about it. But in reality, you've had no meaningful communication with God for months, possibly years. Tell me, do you sense God is calling you? Come back. He is. He's calling you. Come back. Listen, my friends, when you know God is calling, don't put your fingers in the ears of your soul. Don't keep running. Return. Return. Maybe returning is difficult. Maybe you say, well, you don't know the dark places I've been to. You don't know the stuff I've looked at on the internet. You don't know the music I've listened to and the darkness that was in it. You don't know the dark places that drugs have taken me to. You don't know how this is reflected in the inkings on my body. Listen, my friend, you will never be satisfied until you taste again that the Lord is good. You will never be satisfied until you return to him. Maybe you say, well, yeah, but I've been such a hypocrite. I've been pretending to be a Christian, and yet I've been so far away from God. What's God going to make of me? Is he going to laugh at me when I come to him? Jesus reveals to us the heart of God. In his parable of the prodigal son, he reveals the heart, the wonderful heart of God to those who return. When the prodigal son was coming back, returning, when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Listen, my friend, you start coming back to God and God will run to meet you. And remember, this is only the beginning. It's only the beginning still. There's so much more that God has in store for you. And who knows? If you come back to God, who knows how many others might come with you? We'll see more of that another time. But God is calling you. Return to me. Come back. How about it? Come back. Come on, whoever you are, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, however far away you've been. He invites you. He calls you. Come back. Come back.